So this is a talk based on a paper that is out literally last month or going to be tweeted any day now. It's co-authored with my friend Ricardo, who is there. He's actually a former undergraduate with computer science. He's now at Cambridge starting his PhD in some aspect of deep learning stuff. And basically what happened is about 18 months ago, I was teaching this third-year machine learning module that we have, and it's aspects of theory in machine learning. And I thought, I should probably teach this topic, bias variance, because, everyone needs to know that. And I thought, I should probably teach generalization bounds. So that means I need to teach the other topic, approximation, estimation. And then I suddenly thought, well, what's the connection between the two? And I couldn't figure it out. So hence this paper came about. To give you some background. So the bias variance decomposition, this, I hope that pretty much everyone in the room and online has heard of this. It's as old as it comes in machine learning. It appeared first in the machine learning literature in 1992, but it goes back into the 70s in pure statistics. And it's just about, the fitting of models. It's machine learning 101. It's every single machine learning course out there. I'll get into some more details in a minute. Then there's this thing called the approximation estimation decomposition. And this is Vladimir Vapnik in the 70s. And again, this is like the cornerstone of a whole subfield of machine learning learning theory. Things like uniform deviation bounds, which are one of the types of generalization bounds, are built upon this. So if you know these two areas, you definitely know that they're important. How are they described? So the bias variance decomposition is usually described in terms of a trade-off. You will have heard of this, no doubt. The performance of your model gets better and better and better as the complexity increases. Say your deep learning model gets deeper and deeper. It goes down and down, and then at some point it starts overfitting. So we might ask, why is it overfitting? Well, the explanation comes from the bias always goes down and the variance always goes up. And it's the sum of these two terms that makes up the overall performance. And you think, okay, overfitting beyond a certain point. Nice. The approximation estimation decomposition. Well, that's described in terms of a trade-off. The performance gets better and better, and then at some point it starts to overfit. And why and how does that happen? Well, the approximation error goes down and the estimation error goes up. So there seems to be quite a similarity between these two trade-offs. These are 50 years old. These are in every machine learning textbook on separate pages, but they are mentioned everywhere. So surely the link between them has got to be in a textbook somewhere. And when I was looking up, material to teach this course, I thought it's got to be in a textbook. And I looked around and I couldn't find one. What is in textbooks? Statements like this. The trade-off between estimation error and approximation error is often called the bias variance trade-off, where approximation error is bias and estimation error is the variance. So this textbook is saying they're the same thing. There's papers appearing that make explicit statements that these two are the same thing. Approximation error brackets bias, estimation error brackets variance. And this isn't just recent papers, NeurIPS is a very high quality venue, but there are papers going back into the 90s with over 1,000 citations, which make the same sort of statements. And it's not difficult to find papers all over the literature, in the Royal Statistical Society, in ICML, all over the place, that say the same thing, that they're the same decomposition, just written in two different ways. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to try to give you 4 things. First of all, I'll do the no maths version to what is the link between these two decompositions. Then I'll give you a more detailed introduction and tell you the precise relationship. And then I'll tell you 5 interesting things that we figured out as a result of looking at this. I don't know what to do with those 5 interesting observations. I see no practical consequence of this work whatsoever right now. I just thought it was cool to do. So if you find any practical consequence, please tell me. It would be nice to know. So here's the no maths version, right? So the error of a model, that's fundamentally what we're interested in machine learning. And we're going to depict the error of a model by the length of this bar. So we want it to be smaller, obviously. So the error of a model on a given set of data is this. And the bias variance decomposition says that this breaks into 2 components. One is the variance, and that's the sensitivity of the model to changes in its training data. The second is the bias, and that's commonly thought of as the strength of the model. Due to simplifying assumptions in the model, you get a bias in some sense. There are more precise definitions that I'll come on to. And when you change the nature of the model, if you make it smaller, make the model less powerful, you might get a lower variance, but the bias might increase. If you make it a very deep model, the bias will shrink right down, but without appropriate regularization, the variance will grow. And ideally, what we want is to make both of these terms very small. Yeah, so this is every textbook talking about this topic. By the way, I do welcome interaction, so if anyone wants to ask any questions, just go ahead. The approximation estimation decomposition. So this again is a breakdown of the performance of a model. And this comes from the learning theory literature, computational learning theory, and it says that the performance of any model can be broken down into a component of the error that is due to the choice of model and a component that is due to limited data. In addition, and again, this trade-off between these two happens. In addition, there is often thought of to be a third component, which is the optimization error. And this is due to the choice of learning algorithm. So algorithm, data, and model, those 3 ingredients make up the performance of a given system. So we've got these 2 decompositions of the same quantity: optimization, estimation, approximation error, and variance and bias. And to give you the short story, the relationship between these 2 is simply this. This is the result. I'll go into more details in a minute, but approximation error is part of the bias, but it's not the only thing in there. And estimation error actually feeds into both the bias and the variance of a model. But there's weird things. This bit here that sits within the bias can be negative. That seems quite non-intuitive. There's other weird things that occur, like this bit here provably plays a role in double descent, which has occurred in deep learning as a bit of a weird phenomenon in the last few years. So that's it. That's the short story of the whole seminar. You can go further if you wish, but this is the relationship between the 2 decompositions. It holds for any Bregman divergence, which is a class of loss functions, including squared loss. Cross entropy is another one for which this holds logistic loss. It also holds for 0-1 loss classification problems, but it gets quite weird in that this variance term here can be negative. So, like I said, this is purely a theory seminar. For those of you wanting practical consequence, I don't really know at the moment, but we'll come on to implications as far as I've got them as we go further. And like I said, if anyone spots this type of observation anywhere in any papers or textbooks, please tell me, because I am terrified that it's out there somewhere. It just seems too obvious for someone to have not done it in the last 50 years. Let's go into some details. Okay, so bias and variance. We're going to get some notation. Okay, so we've got a piece of notation which is the expectation over testing data points. So this is data points drawn from some unknown distribution, PXY. With that notation, we can talk about the population risk, or just the risk I'll refer to it of a given model. So this is the L there is the loss of a model, which in which the ordering of the arguments matter. So this could be an asymmetric loss function. Squared loss is symmetric, cross entropy is not. So this is the ultimate measure of performance of a model. We can also talk about the empirical risk, which is simply an approximation of that population risk on a finite data set. We can talk about the Bayes model, the Bayes optimal model, denoted Y star, which is in informal terms, the best you can possibly do for a given input. It's the optimal prediction. We can also talk about a quantity, the expectation over training sets. So an average over possible training sets that we can supply to our model. And with that, we can talk about the expected model, or the average model that is going to come out of our procedure. Any questions at this point? Are we okay with this notation? Yeah, okay. So bias variance decomposition. We take the expected risk. So that's the risk, the population risk within there. We note that with the model F, there's an implicit dependence on the training data. So now we can talk about the expectation, the average risk, averaged over all possible training sets that we can supply to it. And this, according to this decomposition, breaks into three components. The noise, which is kind of the lower limit on how small the risk can get. It hasn't got any model parameters in there. The bias and the variance. So as I said, bias is like the strength of the model, and the variance is the sensitivity, the variation around its center to training set variations. And common machine learning knowledge tells us that as the model gets stronger, more powerful, deeper, the bias gets smaller, the variance goes up. This is folklore. It's not necessarily true. Deep models tend not to obey this particular trade-off, so it can be more complex.
Sorry, what is Y star?
Y star is the Bayes model, so the expected value, Bayes optimal, yeah. There's another myth that's out there in addition to this one, that this decomposition only holds for squared loss. It doesn't. It holds for many, many, many losses. So cross entropy, for example, it holds for that. In fact, any Bregman divergence, and there are many, many of those. In addition, it holds for margin losses, which we actually only figured out a couple of years ago. Did a piece of work with Ting Ting. And so logistic loss, it holds for that. I'm not going to go into details, but just to give you a flavor of how broad the implications of the work are, it does hold for lots of different losses. Bregman divergences, squared loss is one of them, and the cross entropy, well, this is the KL divergence, but on a finite data set, that'll be cross entropy. You get a bias variance decomposition for this, and we get a decomposition for any of those losses. So it's a much broader concept than many people realize. I've even seen statements in textbooks saying bias variance only holds for squared loss. That's just not true. As a consequence, you can see down the bottom right-hand corner here, people often refer to the squared bias or the bias squared. So they often call this term in the middle the squared bias, but it's not the squared bias. It's just the bias. This terminology of the squared bias is an artifact because it's on the squared loss. And in the general case, there's no square there. So it still holds as a concept, but you just don't call it squared bias. Okay, so now we're going to move on to approximation estimation. This is going to require a little bit more machinery to talk about. So we've got this first decomposition, this bias variance decomposition that has this trade-off of two terms. Approximation estimation treats things a little bit more formally. We have a space of all possible measurable functions that go from our input space to our output space for a given defined problem. Within that space, we can talk about some model family that we choose to think about. It might be some neural networks of certain depth or decision trees of a certain depth or some fixed class of functions. Somewhere within those spaces, there is the Bayes model, the optimal possible model that can be used. This may or may not be within your model family. In addition, we can talk about another concept, the empirical risk minimizer. So that's given our limited data, given our finite data, what's the best possible model that we can locate? The empirical risk minimizer is the one that gets 0 training error, or at least as low as possible. And that is somewhere within our class of functions. This can be contrasted with the population risk minimizer. So that's if we take away the limitation of finite data, we'll assume we've got an infinite amount of data. What's the best possible model somewhere within our class? And the decomposition that we're talking about refers to a concept called the excess risk. So that is the risk of this ERM model above that of the Bayes model. So if the Bayes model has risk 2 and the ERM has risk 3, so it's going to be higher, then the excess risk is 1. And the geometrically, at least, you can see the bottom right-hand corner. The excess risk can be broken into 2 components. The first of which is this estimation error, this little orange line there, and the second is the approximation error. And so the excess risk as a measure of performance for a given procedure can be broken into these 2 components, blue and orange. Any questions at this point? Okay. So we've got these 2 decompositions, these 2 ways of expressing the performance of a model. They both have this trade-off and this relationship to overfitting, and they're both quite fundamental in machine learning for the last 50 years, but they're written in very, very different ways. They're actually about different quantities. So this is the excess risk, and this is the expected risk. They involve very different terms. So the top one's got the expected model, and the bottom one's got this F-star model. So they seem to be quite, algebraically quite different things. So what we're going to try to do is find a mapping between them, find the exact relationship. So here's the excess risk. That is the performance of the model above that of the Bayes model, and it's broken into these 2 components. The first step 1 of 3 that we're going to talk about, is simply noting that this is about the risk of the ERM, as in the best possible model that you could hypothetically find with your finite set of data. But the bias variance decomposition is about an arbitrary model. So you have some suboptimal learning algorithm that doesn't always perform very well. And so they're about different things. So we're going to try to align the 2 and make them about the same thing. So we can add in, just adding and subtracting some terms. We've got the optimization component. And this came from a piece of work, Botou and Bosquet in NeurIPS 2008. It's quite a well-known 3-term decomposition. I did mention it earlier on, that green component. So step 2 of 3. This decomposition that we see on the screen is about a single fixed training set. The bias variance decomposition is about an expectation over possible training sets. So they are quite different things. So if we take the expected value of this decomposition, we get slightly modified terms. We get an expected optimization error, an expected estimation error. This last term is independent of the expectation, the averaging over training sets, because there's no training involved in this F-star, because it's just the hypothetical best model in the system, in the model family. Any questions at this point?
It's the best model with respect to what? I
The
forgot.
population,
I defined it a couple of times.
the population risk. So the risk, the generalization error. Right. So the performance is always the generalization error, the population risk. And that's the letter R there. Yeah?
Okay, sure.
Okay. So our final step is going to be this, in that the bias variance decomposition involves this expected model, this averaging over possible training sets. So, but the approximation estimation decomposition doesn't mention it at all. Yeah. So let's introduce it. Let's put it just there. We're going to add and subtract it inside the estimation error. What this has done is break the expected estimation error into two components, which we're going to refer to as the estimation variance and the estimation bias. And this is the relationship. So if we look at these first four terms, it turns out these first four terms are exactly the variance of the model. And the second four terms are exactly the bias of the model. So we've related one decomposition to the other by slowly building this bridge between them. Welcome questions. I can see a lot of blank faces right now.
So I saw that like there's a noise component if you go back to the noise.
There is a noise component. It's actually here. So the risk of the Bayes model is the noise component. So if you take that risk component there, take it over to the other side, that's the expected performance of the model, is the noise plus these components. Okay.
So given that the approximation estimation error is sort of usually stated with respect to a particular data set, would the data set affect what the Bayes optimal predictor is? So like what the value of F star is? And is that sort of
What do
yeah,
you mean?
where does that come from?
How do you mean it's stated with respect to a particular data set?
So maybe I misunderstood, but I thought that kind of the critical difference between these two decompositions.
Oh, it's on one data set versus
an
yeah.
expectation across data sets.
Yeah.
So for the approximation estimation decomposition, it gives you the sort of excess risk for a particular data set.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think I'm wondering, so would the data set that you're computing that with respect to affect what the Bayes optimal predictor F star would be? So then when you take an expectation
No.
Okay.
No, because the data sets that we're talking about are training data sets.
Yeah.
And F star is a hypothetical model somewhere within your class of models. So it's like an oracle has reached down and told you
Right.
that model there will get you the best possible performance. It's nothing to do with data.
On that particular data
No,
set.
the best possible
Yeah.
generalization error performance long term,
I see.
on the population.
Okay, so yeah, so then that gap is what the estimation error kind of captures. Okay,
Yeah. Okay. So here's the relationship. So the expected excess risk. One way of looking at it, it breaks it into the bias variance decomposition, and another way of looking at it breaks it into these three components: the optimization, estimation, and approximation error. As I said, in every textbook, we talk about the bias variance trade-off, one term going down, one term going up. In machine learning, in computational learning theory, what people do is form generalization bounds, and there's a class of bounds based on so-called uniform deviation bounds, and that is an upper bound on the estimation error. So both of these terms at the same time. So that class of bounds pushes down on part of the variance and part of the bias, if that makes sense. So like, generalization bounds for finite hypothesis classes pushes down, first step in learning theory course. So this holds for, as I said, for several losses, but these are not definitely not equivalent as is commonly stated in the literature. The approximation error, people often say the approximation error brackets the bias is the strength of the model or the capacity of the model. That's simply not true. Algebraically, it can be seen that there's this estimation bias component in there as well, in the bias. And the estimation error, people often say, well, the estimation error is like the variance, captures the variability in the data. Well, kind of, but the estimation error spans across into the bias as well. So we can't just refer to them as if they were the same thing. And we can, as I said, this holds for any Bregman divergence. So that is a much, much wider class of losses beyond squared loss. So this is the squared loss decomposition, and there's a subtle change to any Bregman divergence. So this is the only terms that changed is this inside the estimation error term. So I can switch it back again. It's just these two terms here that change. And this then holds for, cross entropy, logistic loss, something called the Itakura-Saito divergence, which is used in non-negative matrix factorization algorithms. And so, yeah, this is the relationship, which again, I'm surprised that hasn't been computed at some point in the last 50 years. The term that enables it all, this bit in the middle here, this is the estimation error or the expected estimation error broken up into two bits. And as I said, generalization bounds push down on this, and we get two components to it. The component that we use to separate it is the risk of what we call the centroid model. And the centroid of the model distribution, if you're using a squared loss function, this just happens to be the expected model, the expectation over possible training sets. And this turns out, because of the dynamics, the geometry of the squared loss, it has a Euclidean geometry. If we use a different class of loss function, a different loss function, so we use, say, cross entropy, for example, it turns out that this is a geometric mean, because the loss itself has a non-Euclidean geometry. And if you switch to another loss function, this term is, say, a harmonic mean or some other type of mean. In general, this F with a circle over the top is a quasi-arithmetic mean, and it allows you to talk about the kind of the closest model on average to all possible models according to the geometry of the loss function. And yeah, I'm not going to go into any more details of that, but this concept of the centroid is kind of the term that enables most of the proofs in the work, and trying to figure out how it, what the dynamics of this are as an ongoing challenge. So with that relationship, does anyone want to ask any questions before we move on to some observations? Hello?
Yeah. Sorry, this is not my area.
Yeah, go for it, whatever you want. It wasn't my area until a year ago.
Just some iteration on the central.
Yeah.
If we had an infinite sample size, would it become the optimal model in the permanent?
Yeah.
Okay.
If so, D is the finite training data set of size n, 1,000, 10,000, whatever. But if we could somehow get infinity samples, like the true distribution, then yeah, F centroid is the true model, F star. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So here's some interesting observations. 5 interesting things that once we made this connection, apart from the fact that it didn't appear in the literature already, here's something interesting. So bias variance is not approximation estimation, except when it is. There's a paradox for you. So take an unregularized linear model. So that's OLS, ordinary least squares. The parameters you solve for this come in closed form. This beta is just a function of X as the training matrix and Y, bold Y as the labels matrix. So you have this in completely closed form. So when you do OLS, you have no optimization error. There is no concept of a learning algorithm. It's simply the parameters come in closed form. So that optimization error just isn't there. OLS is what's called an unbiased procedure, in that the expected value of the parameters, the expected value of beta, is actually equal to a true parameter, beta star. So this is, this is the foundation of, going back to Gauss, 1821 showed that the OLS is the blue model, best linear unbiased estimator. And so because this is unbiased, that means the estimation bias is 0. So that term disappears as well. So what do we have? The bias is in fact equal to the approximation error, and the variance is in fact equal to, well, what remains of the estimation error. So in this very, very constrained case, they are the same decomposition, but not in general, and only for squared loss as far as I can tell. And that's as far as I can tell is the caveat there. It might actually be more general, but I don't know. So this is with OLS. If you have any degree of regularization, so if you have a ridge regression, with a little lambda, and you constrain the weights of the linear regression in some way, then this happens. The estimation bias comes back. And so they're not the same decomposition again. Hey.
Don't you have to make some assumptions about the OLS model for it actually to be unbiased? Like your training data has to be basically exogenous.
Yeah, so the Gauss Markov conditions, there are 5 conditions, 5, I think. Like the data has to be IID, the residuals have to be uncorrelated with values of X. And they're very standard assumptions required to prove that the model is best linear unbiased estimator. It's Mr. Gauss from 200 years ago. I won't presume to know more than him.
Yeah, well, if that doesn't hold.
If they don't hold, then OLS is not unbiased, and hence this wouldn't be the same decomposition. Yeah, so they're fairly constraining. But there was a piece of work a couple of years ago that showed that it's not actually even a requirement that it's linear, in that OLS is not just blue, but BOO, as in the best unbiased estimator overall. So it turns out that the linear assumption that Gauss made isn't in fact necessary. So there are, 200 years of assumptions. Some of them are still being developed, but there are assumptions in everything. Okay. So there is basically a scenario where they're the same thing. I have a hypothesis that this might also be true of generalized linear models, but I can't prove it yet. So what can we talk about? So here's the bias variance decomposition written down for a linear model, so X transpose beta. This expression comes verbatim out of Trevor Hastie's nice book, Elements of Statistical Learning. In that book, he made a really nice observation, which, as far as I can tell, was the first time this observation was made. Couldn't find it anywhere else. That the bias can be broken into what he called the model bias and what he called the estimation bias. And with a little bit of algebra, you can actually work out that what he was in fact referring to is the approximation error and what we have also called the estimation bias. So with this work, I guess what we've done is generalized this observation of model and estimation bias, and turns out some interesting geometry in the way this works when you go to nonlinear models. So here's interesting observation number 2. The estimation bias can be negative. Now, this was something I mentioned right on early in the session. So if I have, squared loss, clearly this second term, the one that Hasty pointed out, that is non-negative because it's a squared loss, right? So it has to be non-negative. In general, it turns out that this second term within the bias can be negative. And you might think, oh, maybe it's just a pathological case, but it turns out it's extremely common. How can it happen? Well, it can happen when the expected model is outside the model class. You might think, how can it be possibly negative? Well, that would mean that the risk of the expected model would be smaller than the risk of the best model within the class. And that can happen only if the expected model is outside the class, so it accesses, other models. And this turns out to happen very, very easily. So we take decision stumps. The expectation of a decision, the expected model in the class of decision stumps is not a decision stump. A simple threshold model creates a nonlinear boundary with 4 turning points. So the expected model of a class of decision stumps is actually a model of depth 2 or n. I don't know how far it can go actually. So this extremely easy to happen with just squared loss and decision stumps. It can happen very easily, as I said. The conclusion that we draw from this is that talking about the bias as if it were the strength of the model, the capacity of the model, is flawed. Because your approximation error is the true measure of model capacity. It is the performance of the best possible model within your defined class of models. I can illustrate this point, the bias is a flawed model, in that we've got a decision tree here. We've got the bias and the variance components. We see some degree of overfitting in the left-hand panel here. The bias after depth 5 or 6 goes to 0. So this is, in the sense of the bias variance decomposition, this is an unbiased model. If we look at the right-hand panel, we see that the approximation error is in fact non-zero. So what's happening is that the estimation bias is a negative quantity throughout. So the expected value of a decision tree is not itself a tree of the same depth, it's deeper. So if we were to conclude from this, if I talk to you about the bias variance decomposition, I say, I've got a model that has 0 bias. Should I conclude that my model has sufficient capacity to model the data distribution? No, it can be completely unbiased, but it still does not have sufficient capacity to model the true data because the approximation error is still non-zero. And it's giving you this false sense of hope in that there's the approximation error, and then there's something being subtracted off of it, this estimation bias term, which is making the overall bias 0. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Okay, so this is regression trees, as I said, but it holds much, much more generally. This is a nearest neighbor model. So a nearest neighbor regression, bias goes down to 0, variance goes up in the left-hand panel. Initially, a nearest neighbor model has positive estimation bias, then it goes down as the model gets more complex. So yeah, the dynamics of this are extremely strange. I don't know why or how you can prove when it goes negative. What we can prove, interestingly, is that generalized linear models have non-negative estimation bias. So if you use linear regression, we saw that the squared term guarantees that everything's positive, but that turns out to be general. So you have a GLM, for example, a logistic regression, and it turns out that the estimation bias is always non-negative for that class of model. And the approximation error is obviously non-negative. So the bias is a sum of 2 non-negative terms. See a lot of blank faces. Anyone interject if you want to? Okay. So yeah, you can prove that this is the case. I won't go into the details, but there's a couple of theorems in the paper. It comes out from the geometry, information geometry of the function class that you choose. Very interesting. I'll go into the details. Okay, third observation that's interesting. There is an unavoidable bias variance trade-off that occurs. So this is a nice observation. I didn't initially think this was very important, but Ricardo, my co-author, pushed and said that this is really important to include. So we really did in the end, and I do now agree. So in the recent years, unless you've been living under a rock, with deep learning, people have been saying, deep learning's amazing, it can do anything. And people have published things with quite extreme titles and claims saying, for example, farewell to the bias variance trade-off. They say, oh, this is irrelevant now. Deep models don't obey the bias variance trade-off. And this particular document, which claims that textbooks need to be updated because, the bias variance trade-off is irrelevant.
Downloading it.
Oh, God. Verifying Microsoft Outlook. Thank you very much. These sort of claims are quite extreme. And so this one, in this paper here, they say the main goal of this work is to point out the bias variance trade-off is not always true. And, kind of. And it goes even more extreme. So kiss your bias goodbye. Is the fundamental theory of learning incomplete? And it's just, these claims annoyed me when they first came out. It's not irrelevant. It's not wrong. It's just more complicated than we first thought. So you still get trade-offs. Absolutely. It still is absolutely true. But it's just a bit more complex. One way in which it's more complex I will go on to in the next slide. But here is something that does occur. So these bits claim that the trade-off is irrelevant because you can push bias and variance both down and they don't have to trade off against each other. That was the claim. But it turns out the estimation variance and the estimation bias do have a constraint. They have to sum to what? Sum to a non-negative number, because they are the estimation error when you break them down. The sum of these two brown boxes is a non-negative quantity. The right-hand one, the estimation bias, can go negative, as we saw on several occasions, and is quite easy to prove. Once that one is negative, the other one is constrained to be at least as positive in order to have the overall sum being non-negative. And it turns out that it often goes even further. So there is an unavoidable trade-off between these two terms that occurs. Fourth observation. Okay, fourth quite cool observation. So there's this phenomenon. Hello.
Can I just add a small comment?
Yeah.
So you refer to this paper, just you go back one slide.
Yeah.
Farewell to the bias variance trade-off, the Tarata 21. So that's one paper I've looked through very carefully.
Yeah.
One of the most weird things about that paper, just sort of sharing.
Yeah.
None of their proofs work on deep nets. All the proofs in that paper are linear models.
Yeah.
Something people should know when reading that paper.
Yeah. It's not.
It's a strange claim because actually their maths never works on nets.
Yeah. It's not actually being officially published either. It's only on archive, I think, isn't it? But
If you just look at the proofs, everything is linear.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there are lots of these claims. The biggest claim that is made is that this trade-off doesn't occur, and as Anibit says, it's because deep learning seems to violate this. One of the ways that the main reason people talk about this is this observed phenomenon called double descent. So, as has been observed now recently, since 2018 or so, many times in lots of different scenarios, it is the case that when you increase the complexity of a model or just train it for very long periods, the performance gets better and better and better, so the risk goes down, and then it starts to rise. And you might think, okay, it's overfitting. But then all of a sudden it gets even better. It drops again. It has a second descent, and it goes down to 0 in many cases. And this was an observation made, well, it's got its notoriety from a 2018 paper, but this observation was actually right back into the 70s, I believe, or 80s. This was already observed in statistical mechanics literature and lots of other parts of machine learning. It just didn't receive the publicity that deep learning gets. What is interesting is in recent years, this paper down here and several others have observed that the reason this happens is because the bias is going down, but the variance tends to have a unimodal behavior. So as you increase the complexity of the model, the variance starts to rise, but then at some point, for some reason, which isn't completely clear beyond simple linear models, the variance drops. And so you have this peaked variance, which is the cause of this double descent. And this tends to happen beyond a certain point in the complexity, which people are referring to as interpolation regime, where we get 0 training error. So the model is sufficiently powerful that every model you train gets perfect performance on your training data. So ideally that's supposedly the ideal case, but you can't now distinguish them on generalization performance because you've got 0 training error. The thing is, we know if we focus on this variance component from this piece of work, we know that the variance is actually in 2 components, the optimization error and the estimation variance. And in an interpolating model, as it's called, we have no optimization error, so it's 0. So what we conclude from this is that this double descent peaking variance phenomenon is caused almost exclusively by this second term. So studying the dynamics of this second term, this estimation variance, maybe will give some insight to double descent, who knows? But what I found quite interesting is, Ricardo pointed out this idea that you get this forced trade-off between the 2 terms. So if the estimation bias becomes negative, that forces the estimation variance to go up. Maybe that's what's happening. Maybe the estimation bias is negative around here as the complexity goes up, and that is forcing the estimation variance to peak at this point. So maybe if we were plotting the estimation bias, it would be this value down here, forcing things up. Who knows? So as if this wasn't weird enough, here's one final speculative observation. So a little reminder, this isn't very commonly known, but if we try to do a bias variance decomposition, as I said, squared loss, everyone knows that one. It holds for lots of other losses, including cross entropy. It does not hold for classification for 0-1 loss. What happens in a 0-1 loss case is quite strange, and it's been tackled by many authors. There was this 5 or 6 year period in the 90s when everyone had a go. And if you know the history of machine learning, these authors are like the who's who of classical machine learning. You got Leo Breiman, like the man. You got Trevor Hasty himself. You got Jerry Friedman here, like the guy, important sampling guy. You got Tom Dietrich, who's still very active, and some more people. So these decompositions all make different trade-offs in terms of the way in which they do this decomposition. The main issues they encounter, some of them assume that the noise is 0 in order to get their decomposition. Most commonly, this last term, the variance term, can be a negative quantity. So it sounds quite strange, but it just turns out to be that way. If you have a certain, if you have a decomposition of the expected performance according to 0-1 risk, the variance is negative. And yeah, that's just the way it works. So it doesn't hold for 0-1 loss, but there are still these decompositions that work for it in some way. So we've made a link to this one right here, this James and Hasty one. Some of these all turn out to be special cases of each other, which is a nice thing. Some of them turn out to be absolutely equivalent. So this Tibshirani and James and Hasty turn out to be exactly equivalent, which in turn turns out to be exactly equivalent to Domingos's paper. And then there are special cases and so on. So this relationship between bias variance and approximation estimation, you still get that same relationship without going into the details of it. You get this term not called the bias, but called the bias effect. And you get this term not called the variance, but called the variance effect. And this variance effect can be negative. But like I said, these terms still decompose into the terms known from learning theory: approximation error, optimization error, estimation error, and you get this estimation, bias, and variance term coming out. The reason why it gets very, very strange when you go to 0-1 loss is that all of the terms, except these two, can be negative. Again, so your bias and your approximation error are still non-negative terms, but everything else can potentially be negative, which is extremely strange. And the dynamics of this just don't know the answer. Trying to think about it with Annabit a bit, but potentially, you know, in terms of classification problems, this is the most useful way to go forward. So that's going to bring me to the end of the talk. And somehow, this hasn't been observed as far as I know. If you find a paper out there or a textbook that talks about it, please tell me and I'll retract our paper. And there are several really interesting observations that bridge across classical statistics and learning theory and information geometry. And as I said, this seems to play a role in double descent. Why exactly, we don't know, but we'll figure it out maybe in due course. But that's the end. Thank you.